realized my family had decided my daughter was an inconvenience, not a loss. I was standing alone at a windswept cemetery outside Spokane, staring at a grave that felt too small for how loud my heart was beating, and wondering how it was possible to be abandoned and watched at the same time. I kept checking my phone, telling myself they were late, telling myself there had been a wrong turn or a missed exit, inventing reasons because the alternative was too sharp to touch. The service coordinator cleared his throat twice, the way people do when they're uncomfortable with someone else's grief, and asked if we should begin. I nodded because there was no one left to wait for. When the first clump of dirt hit the casket, my phone vibrated, and for half a second, I believed the universe had finally corrected itself. It wasn't a message asking where they should park or if I needed anything, but a forwarded listing from my father for a lakefront property in Coeur d'Alene with a caption that said, "This could be our reset." The asking price was printed in clean black numbers, almost identical to the payout from my daughter's settlement account that I hadn't even finished filing yet. I didn't cry then, not because I was strong, but because something colder than sadness slid into place and refused to move. I drove home with the heater blasting. Even though it wasn't cold, my coat tossed in the back seat, next to funeral flowers that smelled too sweet and too final. The apartment greeted me with a silence that felt organized, like it had been expecting me, and I stood in the doorway staring at the space where my daughter used to kick off her shoes and announce whatever small drama had ruled her day. I waited for the collapse everyone talks about, the kind where your body gives up before your mind does. But instead I felt alert, precise, painfully awake. I opened my laptop and logged into the family florist account, because I was the one who had always remembered birthdays and apologies, and the order history loaded faster than I expected. The sympathy arrangement had been scheduled 12 days earlier, delivery confirmed, payment completed, all neat and efficient. They hadn't failed to show up because life got in the way. They had planned their absence and checked it off like an errand. I closed that tab and opened my bank dashboard, the joint accounts glowing back at me like a map of mistakes I'd been pretending were kindness. My younger brother had charged a gaming console while I was choosing a headstone. My mother had booked a weekend spa package the same afternoon I signed hospital forms, and my father's name sat quietly on 3 automatic payments I had been covering, without realizing how long it had been happening. I started removing permissions one by one, confirming each change without hesitation, feeling something steady my hands instead of shaking them. When I logged into the cabin security system for the place outside Sandpoint that I owned outright but called ours to keep the peace, I didn't pause before wiping every access code except my own. I remembered my mother's voice from a week earlier, telling me gently that I had always been too sensitive for practical decisions, that I lived in my head too much, that other people were better suited to handle money and logistics. That same sensitivity had apparently made me very useful. By the time I shut the laptop, the apartment no longer felt like a place where something had been taken from me, but like a room where I could finally hear my own thoughts without them being corrected. I sat at the kitchen table long after the screen went dark, replaying conversations, favors, emergencies that always seemed to end with me paying and them reassuring me it was temporary. I realized I didn't actually know when it had crossed from family, helping each other, into something else entirely, only that it had happened quietly and without my consent. The last thing I opened was a spreadsheet I'd kept out of habit, more than suspicion. A running list of expenses I told myself I tracked, just to stay organized. And as the numbers filled the screen, I understood this wasn't grief sharpening my focus, but truth finally getting tired of waiting. I kept scrolling through the spreadsheet until the numbers stopped looking like money and started looking like dates on a calendar I had been living inside without noticing. The first entries lined up neatly with moments I remembered as family emergencies. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became that the crises had rhythm and timing, always arriving when my life showed signs of stabilizing. 4 years ago, when Thomas announced he was done working for other people, the transfers began, steady and unquestioned, framed as temporary bridges that never ended. Helen had called that first time sounding small and frightened, telling me the bank was getting impatient and that I understood responsibility better than Caleb ever had. I remembered how quickly guilt had overridden logic, how I'd wired the money before asking for paperwork, how Thomas's response wasn't gratitude, but relief, as if this outcome had always been assumed. Further down the ledger were expenses I had half forgotten, charges I'd convinced myself were one-offs that somehow formed a pattern when placed side by side. Caleb's rent during the year he was finding himself, the attorney retainer for a zoning issue in Coeur d'Alene I was told not to worry about, the annual maintenance fees for the Sandpoint cabin I rarely used but always paid for. Each line carried a memory of being told I was lucky to be able to help, that it was nice to finally see my success benefit the family as a whole. What unsettled me most wasn't the total but how none of it had ever been discussed as optional. Affection followed payment the way a receipt follows a purchase, brief and conditional. When I paused the scrolling, my eyes landed on the most recent entry, dated 2 days after my daughter's death. A courier delivery fee, overnight shipping, and a note in Helen's handwriting, logged under family support. I remembered the box arriving while I was still numb enough to flinch at the doorbell, how I'd opened it expecting something soft or symbolic. Inside had been envelopes, delinquency notices, a demand letter tied to a Coeur d'Alene property, and a handwritten message reminding me that family steps up when it matters. There had been no question mark, no acknowledgement of loss, just an assumption of continuation. I closed the laptop slowly, feeling something shift from disbelief into resolve. The quiet that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was anticipatory. I was still standing there when the pounding started, sharp and impatient. The sound of people who had never learned to wait for permission. Through the peephole, I saw Thomas's shoulders squared like he was arriving to inspect damage. Helen just behind him, already wearing concern like a badge. I opened the door before they could knock again, and Thomas walked past me without greeting, heading straight for the kitchen as if it were still his. He opened cabinets, checked expiration dates, muttered observations under his breath that sounded less like worry and more like inventory. Helen lingered in the living room, eyes moving over the walls, pausing on the photographs I hadn't taken down yet. She told me softly that the apartment felt dark, that isolation after trauma could be dangerous, that she was only here because she loved me. I asked them what they wanted, and Thomas finally turned, irritation flashing across his face at the question. Helen answered instead, explaining that they had spoken to someone who specialized in grief, someone who agreed I was making erratic financial choices. She set a folder on the table between us, thick and organized, the kind of document meant to intimidate rather than inform. She said it was temporary, just oversight, just until I was myself again, and that it would be a relief not to have to manage anything. I understood then that this wasn't about concern or care, but about continuity. When I asked what would happen if I refused, Thomas didn't hesitate. He said they would escalate, that they would tell people I wasn't coping, that they had already started documenting my behavior. Helen nodded as if this were kindness, adding that it was better to cooperate than force their hand. As Thomas spoke, I noticed how confident he sounded, how rehearsed the threat was, and how little room there was in it for my consent. I realized they weren't afraid of losing me anymore. They were afraid of losing access. I studied my mother's face as she waited for my answer, and saw that her worry had settled into something calm and immovable. The certainty of someone who believed she was entitled to decide my reality. She spoke gently about protection and responsibility, framing control as rescue. And I understood that admitting my sanity would collapse the story she needed to live with herself. Thomas stood behind her with his arms crossed, already impatient, already convinced the outcome was inevitable. I walked to the window instead of answering, needing distance from the table and the papers, and the way they spoke about my life as if it were unclaimed property. Outside, the street was quiet, but a familiar car idled near the curb, and I recognized Caleb's posture through the windshield as he stared down at his phone, waiting to be useful. It struck me then how coordinated this was, how many conversations had happened without me, how long they had been preparing for the moment when grief made me easiest to corner. I turned back and told them I needed time, watching irritation flicker across Thomas's face before he masked it with authority. He gave me a deadline, and Helen touched my arm on the way out, her voice warm as she reminded me they were only doing this out of love. When the door closed, the apartment felt steadier, as if it had chosen my side. I did not cry or pace or reread the documents. Instead, I made coffee, opened my laptop, and called the attorney whose number I had saved weeks earlier, but hoped I would never need. She listened without interruption as I explained everything, then asked for records, messages, transfers, and timelines, in a tone that made it clear she already understood where this was going. By morning, the situation had shifted from emotional to procedural, and that change alone returned a sense of control I thought I had lost with my daughter. The next 48 hours were quiet on the surface, but relentless underneath as accounts were reviewed, patterns confirmed, and legal boundaries drafted with precision. When my family reached out again, it was with a different tone. Their certainty replaced by caution, their demands softened into suggestions. I did not meet them in person or answer their calls. I let formal communication speak where emotion once had. The proposed conservatorship disappeared, replaced by messages about misunderstandings and concern for healing. Thomas tried once more to assert authority, but the words landed hollow now that the leverage was gone. Helen sent a long email about intentions and sacrifice, and I read it once before closing it without replying. Caleb stopped waiting outside my life and drifted back into silence when there was nothing left to collect. Weeks passed, and the absence of pressure created space for grief to arrive properly, without being redirected or managed for someone else's comfort. I visited Sandpoint alone, not to fix anything or pay anything, but to sit by the water and let the weight of everything I had carried finally drop. The money stopped leaving my accounts, and with it went the constant vigilance I had mistaken for responsibility. What remained was quieter and smaller, but it belonged to me. I realized that I had not been abandoned after my daughter's death so much as evaluated, measured, and claimed. And stepping out of that role felt like learning to breathe again. I did not confront them or seek apology, because clarity made those things unnecessary. Some relationships ended not with an explosion, but with a closing door that no longer needed guarding. In the weeks that followed, I built routines that did not include rescue or explanation. And for the first time since my loss, the future felt neutral rather than threatening. I understood then that grief can expose the truth of love and the truth of utility, and confusing the two is what keeps people trapped. Sometimes survival is quiet, and sometimes strength looks like refusing to play the role assigned to you. This story isn't about revenge, but about recognizing the moment when compassion becomes a liability. If this resonated with you, stay connected and follow for more stories about boundaries, loss, and clarity after betrayal. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. At what point does helping family turn into being used?